It's spring game day. The Florida Gators are hot on the recruiting trail, and as always, it's a great day to be a Florida Gator.
You are Locked On Gators, your daily podcast on the Florida Gators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Locked On Gators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to the podcast. Happy Thursday. Happy spring game day, baby. I'm Brandon Olson. Find me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find all my written work with Whole Nine Sports, Giants Country, NFL 33. And I'm about to be joined by John Garcia, but I wanted to remind you, if you're an everydayer, you know what it is, but there will not be a new Friday episode coming out tomorrow. Instead, we're going to go live tonight after the Florida Gators spring game wraps up. We're going to talk about the spring game. We're going to have some fun, and we're going to talk about why Florida's so good on the recruiting trail now with John Garcia. Joining me now for Locked On Gators is John Garcia, Locked On's recruiting insider, and we're getting right into it. It's spring game today. And John, just how important for, not just Florida specifically, but just for schools in general, how important is the spring game for recruiting?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. It's not the fanfare that does it. It's the combination of a mock game day, obviously full padded competition, and really getting a more live look at your potential future, not only coaches, but maybe teammates in action. You know, you're evaluating a whole heck of a lot during a spring game visit. It's in and of itself. And then obviously before, during, and certainly after, you'll get more intimate time with the coaches because it's not a real game day. So there's a lot more allotted time for them to connect with recruits, their families, trainers, mentors, whoever else is kind of in their crew when they do visit these schools. So spring ball is big. You'll see starting Thursday, I would imagine, into the entirety of the weekend, you're going to see a lot of kids narrowing their lists, confirming return visits or official visits. And in a lot of cases, you're going to see verbal commitments kind of fly off the board across the sport this weekend because it's the first big official, or not official visit, first big spring game weekend of the calendar.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's not a real football game. Yeah, it's like preseason in the NFL. It's like you're going to see like a watered down version. You're going to see more backups play, whatever. But for Florida, that's kind of interesting because you've got Austin Armstrong now as your new defensive coordinator. This is going to be our first time seeing his defense in any game type situation. So does that matter for defenders where it's like, yeah, like it's not a real game, so maybe they water down the defense a little bit, not as aggressive or more aggressive because they're just like, screw it. So does that matter if it's like, well, is this really going to be the defense that I'm playing in, or is it going to be different?
Look, what you've installed all spring, you're not going to go away from because there are more cameras and eyeballs on your work. So even if you're just implementing the very basics of the Austin Armstrong defense, you're still going to see that and see that executed pretty consistently. And then you got to think of it again, human wise, from Austin's perspective. This is his first impression too, right? So he wants to leave a positive impression on his players and with his fellow coaches. You know, that's something that is always under discussed in the sport itself. You know, hey, he wants to prove himself to Billy Napier, and hey, this was the right hire. And here are a couple sample plays as to why. And then if you want to translate that over to offense, look, these guys need a look. There's theoretically a quarterback battle going down. There's position battles all over the offense that are going to create sort of the identity or the faces of the 23 Florida Gator roster. So defensively, you know, you've got to help curate that with live looks. And it can't just be, hey, we're going to sit in cover three and allow you to do what you want to do. You've got to dial it up a little bit. And that's obviously something we know Armstrong has no issue with.
Yeah, and now we have to ask about my least favorite part of today's show, but I have to because it's stupid and people want to talk about it. Florida's got their spring game on a Thursday. That's unusual. You don't see that frequently, and opposing schools' fan bases are either crying for whatever reason or mocking for whatever reason. And the whatever reason in both cases is that they're stupid. But what are your thoughts on Florida having their spring game on a Thursday as opposed to, there's like 7 SEC spring games this Saturday?
Right. I don't blame any school for moving off of that Saturday slate because it is loaded, as you just pointed out. So from a recruiting, from a logistical, from a market share perspective, this is a huge benefit for Florida, and kind of all the in-state schools or the big three we're kind of online here. I don't know if this was something they coordinated or if it was a courtesy or just coincidence, but Florida on Thursday, Miami on Friday, FSU Saturday kind of works out for everyone. You know, it's one of those where you're not competing particularly with the in-state recruits. Think of a Charles Lester or Josiah Trader that's considering all three schools, David Stone maybe. Now you could theoretically hit all three of those games and not really worry about it. So the Thursday thing, the first time I saw it, definitely I was like, let me confirm that. I wanted to make sure it actually was on a Thursday, but it does create a bit of a showcase element. And we know this sport is it's every day of the week at this point, right? I mean, it shouldn't be shocking or really a big conversation piece to see a program make this type of decision. And again, within state lines where recruiting is so touch and go, you're creating a singular market share and really the first impression of the schools, that you're most closely compared and coordinated with. So I do think that is a plus for Florida. And you look at the visitor list, I know we'll talk about a few of these guys. It ain't hurting the visitor list for Florida to do this thing on a Thursday. That was maybe my recruiting brain was like, well, how does this work for kids that are traveling from further away? Colin Simmons is coming from Duncanville, Texas, and there's no issue there. So if it really affected the visitor list or something like that, yes, let's be up in arms about it. But if it creates a singular market share on a day that kicks off everything in the state, I think it's a good look for Florida, especially when, again, there's a theoretical QB competition and already going to be a lot of eyeballs on your program. So maximizing that with sort of your own day, I view as a positive.
I don't know about you guys, but it's summer's approaching way quicker than I was prepared for it to approach. So if you're trying to get fit, trying to eat healthy, trying to kind of curb your sweet tooth, like I so desperately have to do, make sure to include Built Bar in your plan. I usually eat them during the day, little midday snack before dinner, so I can just get that sweet tooth satisfied and just have myself feeling good there. But Built Bar's coated in 100% chocolate, so it does satisfy my sweet tooth. Even though it's coated in 100% chocolate, most bars just have 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein, and if you're into calorie counting, which I'm personally not, most bars have just 130 calories. So you can go to built or builtbar.com, and now you can go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and get yourself that Built Bar in the pharmacy section. Yeah, and you just mentioned Colin Simmons, so let's get right into him. He's going to be the first guy we talk about, where he's, if I'm not mistaken, top edge in the country by pretty much unanimously. So what kind of player is Colin Simmons?
He's the quintessential modern edge, just ridiculous first step, a guy who has unbelievable body control and awareness, and he's doing it on Friday nights at Duncanville, one of the premier programs in the state of Texas. So he's going against Power 5 offensive linemen just about every single Friday night. So the competition is stout, and he still flashes dominance off of the edge. I think he's got a lot of true twitch to just stand up or put his hand in the dirt and win with speed, but he's got this counter game that is really starting to develop. He's a very well filled out kid. I don't know what he's listed at, maybe 255 pounds or so. And he uses a lot of that strength and his hands to work inside on occasion as well. So I think he's got the frame and the talent, athletic profile to become sort of an outside in pass rusher that you can maybe move around a little bit. But the calling card, no doubt, Brandon, is, hey, go beat that tackle to the point, and make a play thereafter. There's swiftness here, high football IQ. He redirects well. If his initial move doesn't work out, there's just a lot to really like about Simmons, which is why you see so many stars next to his name and why his recruitment is truly national at this point.
Yeah, what is his recruitment like? Because if I'm not mistaken, he was supposed to visit Colorado at some point, and then like I remember last week seeing a tweet that's just like all caps, like I'm no longer visiting, and it was like a big thing. And it feels like this is kind of not late in the game, obviously, but it feels like it's a little late in the game for Florida to be like picking up the momentum that they're picking up of getting him on campus for the spring game. Whereas it feels like he hasn't been super vocal about any interest with Florida. So just what has his recruitment been like?
Well, it's been kind of as you would expect for a five-star edge from Texas. All of those regional programs are heavily involved, whether it's Texas, Texas A&M, next door, LSU, Alabama, they're all involved, and it's stretched beyond that. The Ohio States of the world are in there as well, but he's well traveled, and he's going to continue to take a bunch of trips, including this spring game visit to Florida. I know at one point last month there was sort of confirmation that he was going to take an official to Florida in the month of June. So I'd be curious to see coming out of the unofficial visit on Thursday how that works. Is that confirmed? Is that something that Simmons continues to throw on the calendar? Because as you mentioned with the Colorado deal, he has planned and unplanned some visits along the way there as well. I think he canceled a USC trip recently too. So look, he's talked about the SEC incredibly heavily and wanting to play there. And remember, Texas is now a part of that conversation for this class of 2024. So I really wouldn't bet against the conference, which sounds silly to say. But when it's truly a national battle where everybody wants in, I do think something like that is significant, at least at this stage of the game. So I think Florida's done enough, obviously, to get this first trip. And I do get the feeling they're probably going to get another trip before this Simmons recruitment comes to an end. And that's the thing. He's really not hinted at any sort of early decision throughout all of his conversations and visits and offers and camps and all of that. He is really talking about taking it the distance from the beginning of his ascent as a recruit. So I think that is better for the non-regional schools involved naturally, right? The Oregons and the Floridas and the Ohio States, and maybe the LSUs of the world that are trying to make up some theoretical ground. The more time you have to do it naturally, the better you feel about it.
Yeah, I don't blame him for canceling visits to Colorado or USC. I wouldn't want to play for Deion Sanders or Alex Grinch either. But flipping to the secondary for here, we've got Xavier Filsaime, who there's been buzz. We've talked about him before, but just more updated version of what kind of player is Xavier Filsaime.
Oh, he's fun. This is a do-it-all defensive back profiles, a little bit like Jakeem Jackson. I don't want to put him in that box because Jakeem's been great since he got to Florida, and he's going to play corner. Xavier is more of a safety hybrid type. I do think he's got the twitch to play all over the secondary, but he does seem incredibly natural at safety. He's originally from Orlando. His family's got Haitian descent, so there's a lot of Florida ties to him and his culture. And that's why the Gators are really at the forefront of this recruitment. But he plays like a Floridian, if that makes sense. He's a guy who is incredibly active and he can run. You talk about the profile of a Florida defensive back. This kid can run. He's clocked 10.5s in the 100-meter dash with a good frame on his shoulders at 6'1" or so. But he's balanced at safety as well. He's not just a speed guy. He's instinctive. He can fill the alley, and then naturally in coverage, you expect him to be able to hold his own, and he absolutely does at a big-time program there in Texas as well, where he's now playing his high school football. So there's a lot to like about X, and there's a lot to like about Florida's chances here in this recruitment.
Yeah, and what has his recruitment been like?
Yeah, another one like Simmons. It's been sort of national. I think when he moved out to Texas, it maybe slowed down just a little bit, but once folks, got eyeballs on him, it picked up in a hurry. And you've got sort of your usual suspects among the contenders for Xavier. I think LSU has probably done the best job among out-of-state schools. Naturally, the new in-state schools for him in Texas are going to try to keep him closer to his new home there as well. But again, all indication is that Florida's done a really nice job in this recruitment.
Yeah, Florida's earned a few, I don't care what you want to call it, predictions, crystal balls, whatever gimmick you want to use to describe it, doesn't matter. But Florida's picked up a few for Filsaime this week alone. How would you feel about it if you're a Florida Gators fan?
Well, look, he's supposed to visit. He's very familiar already, and he fits what you want to do. That's a position we'll always talk about here with high regard because Corey Raymond's commanding that ship. And naturally, when that's a part of the process, you're going to be on the winning side more times than not. You throw in the ties to the state of Florida and Orlando in particular, which is always been more Gator country, compared to some of the other big cities in the state. All of those things play well for the Gator angle here. And I do think that Florida should be viewed as the team to beat here going forward. I'm just not sure when Xavier is going to slow down and actually make that decision, but it shouldn't surprise on the front end if he does it sooner rather than later, if it's indeed Florida.
And the last player to talk about today is going to be Kendall Jackson, defensive lineman from Gainesville, so another Gainesville very own. But what kind of player is Kendall Jackson?
Yeah, he's got a lot of modern traits to his game as well. I mean, you pop on the tape of Simmons and Jackson, and you don't see a whole lot of variance. I think Simmons is a little bit twitchier, but I think Jackson's got a bigger frame to where he could play truly up and down the defensive line. But I think right now he's a true edge prospect, incredibly long, a guy who's still going to fill out into his frame, but you really can't deny the production. I think he had more than 20 tackles for loss, double-digit sacks as well for a really good program there, local to Gainesville, Buchholz. So a lot to like here. And I think his recruitment and his name would be a little bit different if he didn't come up in an SEC town, where he's got geographical ties and even family ties to one program. If this kid was in, the middle of Texas and he really wasn't tied to any school, I think he'd have a lot more sort of attention commanded to his name because he is really an impressive player, a no doubter blue chip type recruit at this stage. Reminds me a little bit of Kelby Collins earlier in his high school career. A lot of people thought he was going to Bama and that was kind of it. But then he got bigger and his recruitment got bigger and folks thought they could really, make a play for him. And obviously Florida won out there. So this recruitment reminds me of that just from an optical perspective to where, he's got this top group that's got Ole Miss, it's got these other schools involved. But really it's because of the assumption that Florida is going to be really hard to beat. So some schools maybe haven't jumped in that you normally would expect otherwise. But look, credit to Florida. You've got to be good. You've got to be consistent. You've got to close well. But if you've got some talent close to home, like an Anthony Richardson, you got to take advantage of it and win those battles just as much.
Yeah, I was going to say, how impressive is it? Because you mentioned his production, and he's got, it was, I think, 22 tackles for a loss, 12 and a half sacks, 2 interceptions, because why wouldn't he have some of those too? But just how important is, we'll say, production like for your recruitment? Because I feel like we see so often these kids who are just like better athletes than at the lower levels that they're playing against. Or not saying Kendall Jackson's doing that, but just how much does production actually go into a recruitment? Or is it more just like, okay, he's got eye-popping stats, let's give him a watch?
Yeah, I think at certain positions, there's a bit of a scale. Like, hey, if the frame and athleticism and the measurables are so off the charts, we don't worry about the production as much. And then conversely, if he's short and stocky and a little bit sawed off, you better be productive, right? You better be, Bryce Young. You better be lighting up everybody that you come across. So I think on that scale, he's on the positive for both. He's got the frame, he's got the classic edge frame in this day and age of college football, but he's also got the production behind it to where you realize he's got polish and he's not such a raw prospect that needs 2, 3, 4 years to develop into an all SEC type of player. I think he's a lot closer to some of those accolades. So, which is, more the reason to think that if, this kid came up in Atlanta, he would be a very well-known and truly national recruit. But good for Florida that he didn't, because some of that perception I do think is closer to reality, and that Florida's got obviously a great shot at this kid.
Thank you so much, John. This is John Garcia, Locked On's recruiting insider. Catch him all throughout the Locked On College channel and still every week on Locked On Gators.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back tonight to talk about the Florida Gators spring game. Remember, tonight, no episode tomorrow because the one tonight is going to happen so late tonight, and we're going to go for the full length. So check that out. For your second listen, check out Locked On SEC, hosted by Chris Gordy, Sports 790. If you listened to yesterday's episode of Locked On SEC, you'd hear me on it. If you don't listen to yesterday's episode of Locked On SEC, rude. That's all I'm going to say. For Locked On Gators, I'm Brandon Olson. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, at WNS_Brandon. Find my written work with Whole Nine Sports, Giants Country, NFL 33, and I will see you all tomorrow.